So much of our faith is built on stories, and many of the Old Testament stories are stories that we learn as children. I came to faith in college, and so I learned this a bit later. But so many of the stories are central to how we look at our faith and even look at ourselves. But what can happen sometimes is that as we get to know other kinds of people, we might actually begin to look at these stories in a very different light. And now what we begin to receive and to see are different perspectives on what we thought was a very well-known story. And what I'd like to do is to pick a story which I assume that you all know, and it's the story of Daniel. And so if you have your Bibles, if you take those to chapel, I don't know, or if you have them on your phone or however you do it, I'll be in Daniel chapter 1 today. Now, the story that we may have learned in Sunday school or as a new believer, the lesson was to be a Daniel, right? I think there's even a children's song about being a Daniel and standing up for our faith. And that's a good lesson. But there is much more going on here than just that. So let me set the stage. Daniel has been taken away from his homeland. The country and his city, Jerusalem, has not yet fallen. And so he will watch the invasion of his country and the destruction of the capital city and the tearing down of the temple from afar. Also, after the temple falls, the utensils and some of the wonderful things of the temple are taken from Jerusalem and they're transported into Babylon. Now, in the ancient world, this would have been quite a blow because wars were also wars between the gods. And if a war was lost, that was an indictment against the God. Because either that God was unwilling to save and protect his people, or the God was unable to fight against the more powerful God of the invader. And Daniel is taken away with some of his friends. And it says here in chapter 1 that they were good-looking young men. They were from the royal family or from the nobility. They came from money, we would say. They were well educated. We know this because they obviously are literate, and not many people at all were literate in ancient Israel. So they were good looking, well trained, well heeled, and they were literate, they were sharp, they were smart. And what Babylon begins to do is to kind of reorient their life. They're given a new name, and now they begin to get trained to help run and be a part of the Babylonian Empire. So let's step back for a moment and process that. They were given a new name. Names that were grounded in their life of faith and in their God. And now those names are taken away and they're given new names. Names not tied into the name of their God, but names tied into the gods of Babylon. Even their name, their new name, in a sense, was blasphemous. And how would they process what was going on in addition to their name? Everything they knew had been taken away from them. Their families, their possessions, their land, their social status, everything had been taken away. Their friends surely would have died in the war, and family as well. Everything they knew, the world as they knew it, no longer existed. And the country or the empire that had destroyed all of this and had taken them away and that had imposed now a whole new identity upon them, that empire was training them, Daniel and his 3 friends, to work for that empire. What was the response? How did they feel about this? What were the emotions that rose within these young people, these young men? Was it humiliation of having lost everything and now being put into a servile position before the empire? Was it anger at what their overlords had done to their families and to their friends and to everything that they knew? Was it confusion about their life of faith and their God? What would it have been like to have been Daniel and the three friends? Now, what I want us to do is now begin the process a bit differently than we might have. Even what I've told you now may be a bit different. This is a more complicated story than we might have learned before. Because what we find is that what they are going through, maybe not as drastic, but echoes of it, is not an uncommon immigrant experience. They come into a country and now people can't pronounce their names. And so they give them another name, or they kind of change the name a bit. This isn't anything new. In this country we have the name Newman. Well, that probably was originally German Neumann, Neumann, and got anglicized to Newman. One of my colleagues, very well-known New Testament scholar, his name is Doug Moo, M-O-O. And so I said, Doug, where did that name come from? And, kind of growing up, was that kind of awkward? And he said, oh yeah, you wouldn't believe the kind of things that people would tell me, because my last name was Moo. You can just imagine all the jokes. And what he told me was when his ancestors, several generations ago, came from Scandinavia, and they showed up at Ellis Island, the man who was registering them couldn't understand their pronunciation of their last name, and so he just wrote down M-O-O, because it sounded like to him like Moo. And so since that time at Ellis Island, his family has been the Moo family. So the idea of the changing of the names, of leaving everything behind, and even if you were a person of status and of well-being and of educated, a group of people and educated families, when you come here, all of a sudden now you're maybe working construction. Maybe you had been trained as a nurse, and now you're doing a different kind of thing. Maybe now you're cleaning houses. And maybe you were an engineer, and now you're working at McDonald's. And now people begin to disparage and to mock and to critique who you are and where you came from, maybe even your language. And all the weight of being the foreigner and trying to survive in a new world. Now, when we come into the story, there's something very interesting that goes on. Because they had designed this whole curriculum for them to learn, and the curriculum would have been just filled with all kinds of religious texts. A lot of the literature was religious literature, so even their training was grounded in a religion that was foreign to them. A religion that they would have rejected, but now is actually part of what they had to learn and to master. They didn't have any choice about their names. They had no choice about the curriculum that they had to go through. They had no choice about their status or where they were supposed to end up at the end of this process. They had nothing like that. There was no space to negotiate anything except something more innocuous, their food. That was the space that still was there. Food is so central to cultural and ethnic identity. I'm half Guatemalan, as I mentioned in the lecture. We eat black beans. We can do this any way you want. We can have, frijol parado, the whole bean. We can have frijol volteado, and they're mashed and they're fried, and it looks kind of like a meatloaf, and you slice it and you put kind of white dry goat cheese with salsa picante. We can have bean soup. We can do beans any way you want. When I was a kid and we were put in schools in Guatemala, one of the things that we would eat for snacks and for lunch was a black bean sandwich. The food, you see. And if you get to know people from other countries, what do they want you to taste? And when you come into their homes, what do they want you to experience is their food. And here, this is what they can negotiate, their food. And basically what they're saying is this: You may have taken away everything I am. My name, my family, my social status, everything I owned. But we are still Jews. We are who we are. And what's fascinating to watch is how these foreign young men are better than anybody else. Oh, that's such a crucial message for our immigrant young people, nuestra gente joven. Because sometimes being a foreigner, there's a stigma, an embarrassment, a feeling, even a projection onto them that they're just not as good as everybody else. They're just not as smart as everybody else. But when I speak on this passage to Latino churches, I say, no, our young people are just as good. Our young people are even better. And we don't need to give away who we are. Somos gente latina. We don't need to be embarrassed of our language, of our heritage, of our parents, of our culture. We have something to contribute como pueblo latino. As soon as you think about the book of Daniel, you see how faithful he is, this migrant, forced migrant, a deportee, taken to a land foreign to him. And he remains true to his faith and true to his people all the way until the end. Have you ever thought of Daniel as an immigrant story? Have you ever thought that maybe there's a different way of reading this story? Have you ever thought that maybe different kinds of people might read this story differently? The stories of the Bible, you see. How do we read the stories? How do we read like they lived their lives? And sometimes what we do is we remove the stories from their original context, and we might get some data about ancient Babylon, and we might get some data about ancient Babylonian religion. But there's some other things that transcend time. There's other experiences that transcend time. There's other realities that are not locked into one place, but there are realities that repeat themselves over and over and over again in history. And this is what we have here, the story of these 4 young men who stay true to their faith and true to their identity as Jews. And the interesting thing that we find in so many young immigrant churches, or young people in immigrant churches, and those who, like me, are kind of a half-breed, is how do you maintain your cultural identity and who you are, even as you move into those of like faith. And in this story, what we find is that Daniel somehow, and his friends, somehow can keep those two together, because they were laced together. The food actually was part of their rituals and part of their Jewish identity and their religious life. So this morning I wanted to give you this new approach to a very common biblical story. Put a new lens on. Maybe talk if you have any classmates or friends who are from a different place. Ask them what it's like to be in school with you. In the school, if I can use this, and maybe this is kind of a crazy way of saying it, in the school of the empire, in a place not their own. What it's like for them. Have they had to negotiate anything away? Because what you find in immigrant families is that the integration process into this country is the constant negotiation of loss. Loss of family, loss of friends from back home, loss of your language, loss of customs, how you embrace one another and what you eat. All these things are now in constant negotiation, oftentimes, of loss. And that's what makes home so hard, because the parents are watching their children going through this process, even as they themselves are going through that process as the adults. So talk to your friends, talk to those from another place, and ask them, and just listen to their stories. And maybe when we say, be a Daniel. You'll have a different take of what that means. So hopefully, this has been an interesting way of getting at a very common story, and I pray God's blessings on you as you grow in the faith and become more sensitive to those around you. Thanks so much.